Hello, everybody. Welcome to our YouTube channel for the Realignment podcast. We only post here 2 times a week, and we do not do video every single time. But, Marshall, where can they find us?
You can find us anywhere you listen to your podcasts, Spotify, Overcast. We've got the works, so be sure to subscribe to see the Realignment wherever you watch or listen to your podcasts.
That's right. Okay, so with that very brief introduction, let's get to the episode, shall we? Krystal Ball, welcome to the Realignment.
It's great to see you guys.
I never get to introduce you, so this is kind of fun.
Well, yeah.
It feels a little weird, I will say.
Yeah.
One thing too is it's welcome back to the Realignment because
Realignment.
We all last spoke together in February, which on 15 different levels was a totally different world. So that was right when you guys released your book. You were sort of in the middle of Bernie doing really well. There was no pandemic, so it's been a while.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, Krystal, I think that's the one thing that we should start off with, which is that obviously we've been doing the show now for months and months and months, but we haven't really had a time to at least publicly process what the hell has happened in the last 7 months and kind of where kind of things stand. How do you think things stand right now, kind of for people who are inclined for our politics and who are populists? Are there things to be hopeful? There's a lot of despair, which we talk a lot about. Just where's your head at currently?
God, it really depends on like the day, the minute, the hour, because look, at the national level, it's just deeply grim. Not only do you have on the political front, Joe Biden, who has gone out of his way to basically not only not give anything to economic populists, but to actively crush that. He doesn't even talk about even some of the things that he supports, like $15 minimum wage. He doesn't even talk about that. It's not something he's running on. I would be shocked if he actually pushed for something like that in his administration. So at the top, it's very grim. We know what type of people he'll put in his administration. We know who he's listening to. We know who he'll go out of his way to screw and to try to crush. And yet there are hopeful political signs as well. You see a sort of grassroots insurgency. You see some new strategies, some new bottom-up strategies that are really bearing fruit. One thing that we talked about, which I think may be actually the most hopeful model for my politics that I've seen, is in Rhode Island, small state, where you only need a few thousand votes to win in these primary contests. There was a concerted effort to run a lot of economic populist left candidates who I think they ousted 8 different incumbents in one night, which will just completely shift the tenor of that state house. And so I think for now, that's probably the more likely direction to pursue. Bernie was kind of a unique one-off type of person who was able to galvanize this national movement without actually having the infrastructure and the bench and the sort of organizational backing to really build that up. There's no one out there who's exactly in the model of like would be his successor clearly and would be ready to go in 2024, or the sort of strategic or organizational model behind them. A lot of the left is engaged in these kind of like internecine battles, which are like deeply destructive and really annoying and all of those things. So I guess that's what I would say. And then, obviously the big picture that we talk about all the time, you guys talk about too, is these just like underlying dynamics of all the trends. Every single one of the trends that brought us Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders has been accelerated, right? This mass inequality, like the deep and obvious unfairness of our economy, the humiliation that's been visited on working people. And meanwhile, you also still have these massive demographic shifts that create a sort of turbulent political economy and demographic reality as well. So all of those things have continued and probably been exacerbated during the pandemic. So you have to think that there's some kind of a shift coming. It's just a question of when and how, and is it done through conventional, peaceful political channels or not?
Can you speak to I like the way you frame that, and there's a contradiction in it because there's been a lot of friends of both the Realignment and Rising who've been dunking on us for this. They're like, "Where's your realignment now?
Yeah.
Biden won the primary. Josh Hawley did X, Y, or Z thing we find disappointing." You're talking about how there are these trends which we're seeing accelerate that should support populism. But we're sort of seeing, even with President Trump, sort of him govern more as an establishment person. So could you speak to this dynamic and sort of why, in the short term, it seems like the establishment's actually sort of cleaning up?
It's a deep contradiction. And look, part of it is that a lot of working class people are so disenfranchised, so disgusted with the political system that, I mean, we have mass rates of non-voting where people just don't believe that the political system is going to deliver for them. The unrest that you see in the streets, the riots that you see in the streets, is not justifying them, but that's an expression of that same feeling of like, these political channels, Obama saying like, don't boo, vote. Like, we did that shit and it didn't work out. We're still here. You didn't really fundamentally change anything. So it's a really unhealthy kind of a situation for a democracy to find itself in. On the Biden coalition, which is shifted, it's a real realignment, moving the Democratic Party even further in the direction of catering first and foremost to this affluent white suburbanite. This is something they've been chasing for years and years and years. And a candidate like Bernie Sanders was kind of a last-ditch attempt to stop that full movement of the Democratic Party into white affluent suburbanite land, where you cater, those are the people you actually cater to, their interests, and then you keep the black and the brown working class in the tent, at least somewhat. I mean, they're still bleeding Latino voters right now to Donald Trump, but you keep them in the tent somewhat by just saying, well, the Republicans are awful and the Republicans are racist, and Republicans have given them certainly plenty of fodder to be able to do so. And so as long as the working class remains divided along racial or geographic lines, primarily racial, but also geographic lines, then it's the, affluent suburbanites combined with the actual, elites, wealthy elites who rule everything. And that's exactly the dynamic that we have right now.
Right. And Krystal, I think that's one of the things I really want to delve into here, which is that, you have this Biden Republican case, which we've talked about here on the podcast, and we talked about on the show. Rahm Emanuel kind of like saying the quiet part out loud. He's like, no, we should do what Ronald Reagan did. We should bring these like wealthy, elite, suburban people into the coalition, and we should govern with them for all time. And frankly, I mean, it kind of makes sense in the short term. Like, it's not a bad strategy to vote. It's within the existing electorate. These people all vote a lot. They have a lot of political interests. The non-voters are just going to continue being non-voters. What's the case against that? Not just for the left, because the left has a political mission, for the Democratic Party, politically, because right now, politically, I'm like, hey, okay, seems like a fine bet. Why shouldn't somebody go down that road? What are the risks?
Well, if all you care about is winning elections, it's not about strategy, right? And we see that right now, although even right now in the purely take the values out of it and just like, we want to win elections, that's it, end of story. Even in that, you see the risks, right? You see Latino support bleeding away. You see a depressed level of enthusiasm among Biden voters. You see young voters, feeling deeply dismayed and disenfranchised, and like no one is representing them. And they're, of course, the ones who have been most crushed in the pandemic, most crushed in the financial crisis, most crushed by being sent off to fight and die in wars overseas, right? So they're completely disenfranchised and unenthusiastic. And so that is the risk for Biden right now. If he loses, that is exactly why, because they've done nothing to excite those parts of the Democratic Party coalition that, by the way, were the parts that were the most enthusiastically for Bernie Sanders. So even taking the values out of it, you run a risk by just going all in on the Biden Republican, the John Kasich types. For my political views and the project of building a multiracial working class, and the project of having an economy that works for people outside of the top 10% of Americans, it's an utter disaster. And the perfect example, there's actually a perfect contrast here. between the way that the Democratic Party is constituted in Virginia, which is now a suburban dominated state, versus Nevada. So in Virginia, this is now a blue state. It's my home state. I've watched this evolution over decades now. Be very hard for a Republican to win at the state level ever again. And Democrats hold both the House and the Senate, so they can do whatever they want, right? They can set the agenda. They can do whatever they want. And they campaigned on things like raising the minimum wage. They campaigned on things like, improving union rights. This has long been a right to work states, quote unquote. But when they got into office, they didn't really do any of that stuff. They've mostly been obsessed with things that I support. I'm not, claiming that this is nothing or that I don't support it, but it's things like, let's pass the ERA, right? Let's have a new equality act that's going to prevent discrimination this or that way. Again, good. Everyone should be equal before the law. No problem there. But the issue is they never get beyond that. It's still the state that is worst in the entire nation, a blue state that is worst in the entire nation in terms of workers' rights. And that is what a suburban politics looks like. Now, some other thinkers will say, even on the left, will say, well, look, suburbanites are teaming up with you. If you ask them on economic issues, they're more liberal than the general public. They're more liberal even than Democratic leadership. And that's true. But the problem is, it's not just what do you answer on a poll question. It's what are you going to fight for? What are you going to withhold your vote over? What are you going to go into the streets for? What are you going to push your politicians to actually do? Because if you're not going to hold them to account, they're not going to do anything. They're going to continue to please their donors. They'll put some progressive window dressing, identity politics type window dressing on top of it. And suburban voters are going to be totally satisfied with that and comfortable with that because that doesn't threaten their prospects for their kids. They want to make sure they get the same life that they have. So that is the danger. Nevada's a different model. Nevada's really, to the extent that it's a blue state, and it is a state that leans blue at this point, that was built through a labor movement. That was built through, the Culinary Workers Union in Las Vegas, very strong, many members. And so that's much more of a sort of multiracial working class coalition based on the service economy there. And so you end up with a different type of politics. And that also expressed itself in the Democratic primary where the state went so strongly for Bernie Sanders over the objections of a lot of the kind of elite Democratic leaders in the state. So you see the results ultimately end up being incredibly disparate for the reality for working class Americans in the country.
Yeah. So something that's interesting in your sort of earlier point was this acknowledgement that a lot of people just care about winning elections and these sort of ideological debates don't really matter as much. But the sort of thing I want to put forward is, what if winning elections is actually all that matters when we look at the Supreme Court, we look at the sort of executive level decisions? Because the problem for me is that I sort of look back at what happened with Ralph Nader in 2000. And yes, there can be this debate about whether or not he truly swung Florida or not. But a lot of people, regardless of the actual outcome, were swung by the belief that fundamentally a Democratic Party that argues we're better than Republicans or a Republican Party who argues that they're better than Democrats is a bad thing. Well, a bunch of things happened during the Bush years that I definitely do not think would have happened even under sort of center left to center Al Gore. So how do you think about that dynamic when the courts are up for grabs?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real trap. This is what you're articulating is the conundrum. Just given the structure of democracy that you really only have the two choices for the two major parties, which is why I've always thought that, yes, third parties can be important for pushing different issues and putting issues on the radar and forcing different parties, forcing the two major parties basically to align more with what those third parties are offering. But ultimately, the game is played out inside of the two major parties. That is the reality of the political landscape. So I think any project of sort of successfully moving the country in one direction or the other, at least through traditional political channels, has to be fought inside of those two parties. It has to be fought through primaries, has to be fought through basically taking over the institutions themselves. And it has worked in the past, right? In fact, the Democratic Party, as it's constituted now, is the result of basically a sort of takeover by the DLC Democrats, the Clinton DLC Democrats in the 90s. That is the reason that we have the terrible Democratic Party, in my view, that we have today. Donald Trump could have taken over the Republican Party if he kind of like had his act together, had some real ideology that he was willing to fight for, had some institutional backing behind him, like really had any care or concern to actually work on that project. That was all there for him. It's just that it was easier for him to sort of get co-opted by the existing Republican institutions, and ultimately he didn't really care. So that's how he ended up. But that prospect was there. You saw some of it with the Tea Party, right? The Tea Party very effectively pushed the Republican Party hard right on a lot of economic issues in particular. That was a relatively successful outing. And you came very close with Bernie Sanders, ultimately. I mean, you know, it's easy now, especially looking at the final tally, to be like, oh, he didn't even come close. But I mean, he actually really did. Like, he was within a week of things falling completely the other way. And so to me, that's where the game has to ultimately be played, because you're right, Marshall, like ultimately you look at the numbers right now and there isn't a significant vote going to third parties. There are, and I also am not one of these people who doesn't want to pretend like there aren't real differences between the two parties. There absolutely are. So when you're in this lesser two evils dynamic, the only thing you can do is try to fight to change the party that you think is most likely to ultimately represent the interest, not just your interest, but the interest of the working class, which is what ultimately I think we all care about here.
So, Krystal, I want to spend some time on this because this is what we've spent a lot. And obviously, for Rising, the number one question we get is about third parties. Surprisingly, number one question we get here also about third parties.
Third party interest.
Every single
always third
time.
party. Yeah, every time it's always about third party.
Yeah.
And I've even been like, guys, like, enough. But no.
Yeah.
I'm not blaming them. I understand where the sentiment comes from. So you made a very critical point there, which is that ultimately, in your view, a third party's most critical, the way that it can best use itself is to force an existing political party in order to a certain action, maybe left or right or center, wherever. So when it matters, when we think about the Bernie campaign or we think about successful party efforts, what matters more? Is it the movement or is it the leadership? Because obviously, the Bernie movement was, it's robust. I've seen it, and you've seen it as well. But because the leaders who were in charge, Sanders himself, as well as, AOC and others largely decided to play ball with Joe Biden or not try and fight for anything, I wouldn't say they neutered it, but they made it so that the power that they could have wielded certainly was not wielded. So what matters more? Is it the movement or is it the leadership or is it a mixture of both?
Gosh, I mean, obviously it's a mixture of both, but I think I have to go with kind of what's ultimately an unpopular answer, given especially the left's like love for the grassroots, which I share and which I'm not going to say isn't important. I just talked about the victory in Rhode Island, which in a lot of ways was a grassroots effort. The Sunrise Movement is having a massive impact across the country. Like those things are real and they really matter and they're issue and policy driven. But we live in a celebrity culture. And so it used to be this idea like all politics is local. All politics is kind of national now. You were sharing with me, Saagar, some research that basically says candidate quality doesn't really matter that much because people just vote their partisan divide, right? That's a reflection of the fact that politics has become so national. I mean, I saw this in Kentucky and other places where it's played out, where you used to be able to have a separation between like, oh, well, this is a Kentucky Democrat and this is a national Democrat. That's not possible anymore, right? Everybody is like lumped in together. And so in that kind of celebrity culture, with politics really covered in that way too, the leadership really matters because those are the people who are going to be able to impact the news cycle. Those are the people that are going to be able to kind of like hone and focus all the forces in one direction. And we've seen this on the left since the end of the Bernie campaign without one figure kind of like galvanizing everybody in one direction. It has kind of just devolved into a lot of infighting about what the right issues are and what's the right approach and what's the right strategy. And are you problematic? Are you problematic? Who should be canceled? I mean, it really has turned into that, like who in this movement is even allowed to be in this movement or speak for this movement. So yeah, ultimately, I think the leadership really, really does matter, which is part of, it goes back to your question at the beginning, like, how are you feeling, Krystal? It's just not great because there's not a clear successor and there's not a clear path. Now, what I kind of tell myself, and what I think is true based on what we've seen, is that the landscape is shifting so incredibly rapidly every single day that just because you don't see a clear path, like, it doesn't really mean anything, or see a clear leader doesn't really mean anything. Before Bernie Sanders jumped into the 2016 race, like, no one was thinking about that guy, really running for president. So these things can emerge really quickly, and forces can be galvanized really quickly. That's something that is different about the media landscape today. But I do ultimately think that the leaders end up being fairly determinative.
I'm really glad you articulated the sort of problem of the hyper-nationalization of politics. It's something that I'm really sort of concerned with, but not in a sort of annoying, like Ben Sassy way, but like actually, like, this is like a huge operational problem that you can't have like you said, a Kentucky Democrat would probably be a little more socially conservative than a sort of like a Democrat from Oregon, where I'm from, or a Democrat from, New York or something. So that's a huge issue. But the question then is, and this is also acknowledging your point that we can't always see the path, like, directionally though, what do you think would be the tactic for sort of forcing back against that? Because from my perspective, the hypernationalization of politics basically helps sort of both parties' establishment, in the sense that the more every race is about who you're going to appoint to the Supreme Court, the more this is sort of about insert culture war issue of the week, the less it has to be about actually changing the orientation of best parties to be more reflective of sort of the better working class coalition thing we're interested in. How do you think about that structurally?
I don't know the answer to that, Marshall. I'm just going to be super honest with you, because I think that's the conundrum. I think that's it exactly right there. Because right now it seems like within the Democratic Party, like, the neoliberals have basically won. And at the moment when the left had the most potential power, right, before Bernie drops out of the race, when they need him to fall in line, when they need him to say, okay, guys, come on, we got to get in behind Joe Biden, like, he asked for nothing. And all of the left organizations also say, look, we're going to push you on these things, but really you have our votes already. That's a moment when you have political leverage and power, like, this idea. And look, I mean, I'm going to do my best as well, but this idea that once you have a Biden administration, that's when you can really start to push him. It's ultimately a fantasy. And the reason, and this isn't the first time that we've seen this dynamic play out, because ultimately our politics has become an existential battle. This is what terrifies me. I mean, truly terrifies me. Liberals believe Donald Trump is literally Hitler. Literally Hitler. And I understand why they believe that, because number one, it gives them some fodder for that. But number two, they've been fed a steady media diet of that for 4 years. And so if you're like, this guy is literally Hitler, then yeah, your like grievances about Joe Biden seem pretty stupid and like inappropriate to level at this moment. So when you create this existential politics where if the other side wins, like, this is literally the end of democracy. That is how it is seen. This is literally the end of democracy. And by the way, you hear that rhetoric on the right too. I'm not sure that it's quite landing, because Joe Biden is so hard to kind of characterize in that way. Yeah. I'm not sure the right is really fully bought into this is literally Hitler, Joe Biden. But that's the type of existential politics that we exist within. And so when that is the case, yeah, all of your policy differences, all of your concerns about the trajectory of the party become sort of null and void, because you got to just do whatever you can to keep literal Hitler from getting reelected. And we don't have time to hear your concerns about, oh, the working class is struggling. We don't care. We just have to get this guy out of office. That's the trap. And it's the trap this time around. It was the trap with Bush. It's always where we end up. And I'm not sure how you get out of it ultimately.
I think and I completely agree. It's just, what's crazy to me is that I sometimes try to think about this mentally as you bracket the existing political conundrums that we have: hyper-nationalization of politics, MSNBC, Fox News, and, the current party establishments. But then at the same time, like you said, you've got Rhode Island. We've got, Your and I show has exploded. You got a guy like Joe Rogan, who now the president is talking about. You see this massive influx of people into new media, into independent streams, and more. And we shouldn't overstate that power, but we shouldn't understate it either. What does that mean, kind of in the context of all of this? Because for every time, as many boomers who are out there getting brainwashed by MSNBC, there are millennials who are watching you and me, or they're listening to this podcast, or listening to Joe Rogan's podcast, and all this. Is that a hopeful thing? Is it more balancing than we should think? What do you think about that?
I think it's a piece of information about the distance between elite rule and the desires of the public.
Yeah.
And anytime you have that distance, it creates opportunity, it creates tension. It can explode in productive ways. It can explode in deeply destructive and frightening ways, right? So to me, it's a piece of information about a possibility that exists, but in what way is that possibility ultimately expressed? And is it a way that moves us forward or sort of rips the country apart? That part I don't really know, which is why, and this is kind of hokey and I mean it in a kind of hokey way. Part of why I find what you guys are doing so important, part of why I'm, really proud of what we do on Rising is because we have to believe that our fellow citizens are basically decent human beings and who might have different, who may have, it is a hot take, right? It's controversial to say because all of the incentives in traditional media and in our political economy are to paint not just the politicians on the other side, but the voters on the other side as actually evil actors who want to destroy you and your family in the country and all of those things. And this country can't survive. We can't survive that way. So the fact that there's an appetite for that conversation, for that sort of, discussion that's focused on, a belief, a faith in the basic decency of, people in the country is hopeful to me and is a piece of information as well. I think the other thing that I would say here is that in terms of a path forward, to the extent that there are any real things I would say that number one are hopeful and number two we need to do, the fact that young Americans have a very different type of politics than older generations, basically millennial down, has a very different way of thinking about politics and engaging with politics. That's a potentially hopeful thing. The other piece that I would say is I think any sort of populist economic movement has to have at its core a re-energized labor movement.
Yes.
And there's been a lot of research around, and I really appreciate, Saagar, by the way, you having a heterodox view on this on the right. There's been a lot of research around, this is one of the only places where working class people of different races engage. And it reduces racial discrimination. It reduces this hyper partisanship. It's actually a really good thing for society, a healthy labor movement. And for people who are skeptical of big government or whatever, this is a way for workers in their own workplace and communities and towns to have and exercise power and form coalitions and do so in a way that's real and engaging with other human beings, not some bullshit Twitter conversation. Mm-hmm. So for me, a reinvigorated labor movement is probably an essential part of a better ultimately politics in terms of working class people.
So speaking of Rogan, I want you to put on 3 different hats here. Hat 1 is you've been on Rogan. Hat 2 is you've been a candidate. And hat 3, you're a political commentator.
Yeah.
Should or shouldn't Joe Biden go on Joe Rogan? Right? And at a very meta level too, right? Because I was sort of annoyed at some of the sort of takes where people were like, oh, Dementia Joe would never go on the show, which actually Joe put in a request to go on the show during the primary, so it's actually a little sort of complicated. But how should candidates, especially center-right, center-left candidates, think of this sort of new media thing? Because obviously Trump, I think, in a weird way, would do well on Rogan, but I'm not really sure what Biden to sort of do. So what do you just think about that?
It's an interesting question because the strategy piece and the good for the public piece are kind of at odds. Because from the strategy perspective, I can't really argue with their strategy of really picking and choosing the Biden, Joe Biden spots in terms of who he sits with and what the setting is and how much control they have over it. I can't really say that that's been the wrong political strategy. They're betting on not paying any political price for not taking more questions and not being more accessible. And I think they're probably right about that bet. In terms of American public and the quality of the discourse, it's deeply sad that that kind of a freewheeling conversation would be something that, that the Democratic Party, but I mean both parties in general would not be really comfortable with and not really want. Trump can't resist the media. He can't. It's not like he has good intentions here. He just can't resist the spotlight. His ego needs it. I mean, he knows he shouldn't be talking to Bob Woodward 19 times, but he just can't help himself doing it. So that's where it comes from. It's not like any sort of benevolent I really want to inform the American public here, right? Let's be clear about that. But
I believe in transparency, people.
Right, exactly. Okay. Right, exactly. But this has been, and this gets back to the point about this being an existential choice now. It's been such a substance-free election, certainly the most substance-free election I can remember and potentially in American history in terms of policy and plans. Nobody has any clue what either of these candidates would do if they actually get elected. And it doesn't really matter to them because all they need to know is that it's not the other team. That's it.
Yep.
So when you have an existential election like that, any sort of policy or plans or vision ends up going by the wayside. The debates don't matter. Even if they went on Joe Rogan for 4 hours and, I'm sure it would be a fascinating exchange. People would be excited about it. They would listen to it. Would it ultimately make a difference in terms of electoral outcomes? Very unlikely.
So that's actually the part that bothers me most, Krystal, which is that, we know this whenever we interview Congress, most of these people suck. Most of these congressmen,
gloves off, Saagar.
Anything. I'll say it. I don't care if they. I know some of them even listen. Look, most of them are uninteresting. They couldn't survive 3 hours on Rogan. They don't have 3 hours worth of thoughts. A lot of them are just people who are anodyne, inoffensive to a party establishment, and that's why they get chosen to go in the first place. And then per what we were talking about earlier in terms of the Nate Silver analysis, which is that a recent regression, just for everybody's awareness here, and we can throw it up in the show notes or something, which is that now candidate dynamism, the difference in a candidate does not matter. Raw partisanship is actually the most predictive outcome of your election or not. And so that is actually what I think depresses me more, is that we live in this hyper-nationalized age, but the type of system that has evolved in order to churn out these politicians who come out on the national stage is not necessarily a great one. We don't have some pretty inspiring people. But what I want your thoughts on, Krystal.
You might say they're not sending their best, Saagar.
They are not sending their best. But the left was the first to break this model. And I haven't seen it yet on the right. I think largely because the right is still more controlled by the establishment. AOC, the Justice Democrats, they're the ones that came up with that model. And since you've been involved with this world, could you tell us the intellectual genesis of where did it come from that people were like, you know what? Fuck this. We're going to run AOC. We're going to run a Cori Bush. We're going to run a Rashida Tlaib who come to DC. And look, we've criticized them plenty on the show. They're not the great revolutionaries as sometimes say they are. But, they're better than nothing if you're a leftist. And we don't really have the same corollary on the right. So where did it come from?
Well, I think part of why that model has been able to succeed is because of the changing landscape around money in politics. So the positive thing that has happened, and this started with Obama, and I think is more fully developed on the left, which is part of why this movement is possible on the left and not so much possible on the right, is because you do have this massive army of grassroots donors who will kick in their small dollar contributions and give you enough money to be able to compete. So AOC was massively out fundraised and outspent, but she had enough to be able to get the message out and be able to make some waves. She, of course, is uniquely talented in terms of like capturing media attention and capturing social media attention, really was like native to that and understood that, so that she was able to amplify her dollars as well. And so I really think that's the piece that has changed the dynamic, where now there is an alternative model to having to go and suck up to all of these same donor types that exist within the regular party establishment. I mean, when I ran for Congress in 2010, this is very early days for this. There wasn't that same like national grassroots fundraising base established. And so I literally called every single Obama donor over $1,000 in the entire country to try to raise money for my campaign. Like it was painful. 'Cause I literally did not know any rich people. Okay. So to cobble together that money, like, and that means those are the people you're talking to. That means those are the people you're making promises to. That means that's who you're beholden to. That's where your power comes from if you're having to operate within that model. So now there's an alternative source of power, and there's an alternative model that's available to you. And so that is one of the most promising and hopeful things on the left. And it's a lot harder. This is where just like pure human nature comes in. When you're basically just AOC and the squad, right? Rashida and Ilhan and Ayanna, who is a little bit more of an Elizabeth Warren type. But when you're just those few people, it's really hard to resist the siren song of like Nancy Pelosi's Mama Bear and this is our team and all of those things. The more that you build, the strength in numbers is a real thing, because then you have a coalition, then you have sort of like just psychological comfort in knowing that you've got this group of people behind you. So I'm really interested to see if there's a little bit more of a radicalizing dynamic of now this time around you're going to have the squad, you're going to have Jamal Bowman, you're going to have Mondaire Jones, you're going to have Cori Bush. She's the one I'm really particularly excited about. She's got a lot of fierceness to her. And I mean, real like working class story, been homeless, lived all of that, is very close to all of that. So, but yeah, I think that's where the model really where the possibility for the model came from, was this alternative potential source of power and funds outside of the traditional Democratic establishment donors.
Yeah. Well, quick pushback, Saagar, and this actually takes us back to 2010, which is that I don't think the left could claim an exclusive sort of mantle on like primarying people, because that's what the whole Tea Party thing was. Right. And because that's actually the critical sort of like, this is us like showing.
I guess I'm just trying to whitewash it because I want to black out whatever happened.
Well, yeah, because that's actually
all we have are Justin Amash in Congress.
Well, yeah, but that's a real thing, and I think, and this, so this is what I want to sort of know about here, because look, the Tea Party politically was incredibly successful, right? Overthrew a speaker, hobbled Speaker Ryan in many, so with the overthrew John Boehner, hobbled Speaker Ryan in many sort of ways, really sort of scared the sort of DC establishment. And then obviously that didn't go anywhere. We didn't repeal Obamacare, right? Like at the end of the day, the only thing that was delivered was sort of like tax cuts. Like whether you support that or not, like that was not the literal only thing that they were running on in 2010 and 2012 and 2014. But what I would just sort of say here, though, is to me, it seems the reason why the Tea Party was more effective as a political movement in Congress was it was probably more reflective of like the GOP base, as in there were probably like a sort of boomer, fiscally conservative, socially conservative, anti-Obama base in probably every single congressional district. But it's not quite clear that there's an actual like squad or Justice Democrat crew that could fit in more than a third of the districts in the country. So how should sort of like the progressive left, who's sort of looking at sort of how the Tea Party went down, how should they be thinking? Because I just don't think the squad policy agreement or not is as reflective of how actual Dem voters feel as the Tea Party was for GOP voters.
Sure that I agree with that. I mean, first of all, the Tea Party was a little more amorphous. I mean, it was partly like reaction to Obama. It was partly like, it was very reflective of this particular strain in the Republican Party, which is like the sort of small business merchant class, like very fiscally conservative, very like libertarian on that. And, very socially conservative as well, of course, but they always frame themselves as like, no, we're just about like cutting spending. And if you're just about cutting spending, they're very effective at pushing politics to the right on those issues. But I don't know that that really is deeply reflective of the Republican base of the party. In fact, if you're talking about just fiscal austerity, in fact, the politicians in Washington, the Republican Party, are out of step with where a lot of the Republican base is. On the left, I think it really depends on what issues you're talking about, right? There's on economic issues, certainly the squad is very reflective of where the Democratic Party is on Medicare for all, even on Green New Deal, certainly on labor rights, on minimum wage, all those things. They're very much in line with the base of the Democratic Party. I think when you start talking about more social issues is when you have a little bit of a split there, and the politics are somewhat less popular among the Democratic base. So I do think there is an opportunity there. And one of the things that has been hopeful this time around is you've had some of the corporate behavior of the Democratic establishment actually put in a spotlight, and that corruption of the Democratic elites in the party put in a spotlight. Whereas it used to be there's no accountability for that. You could get away with, selling out to big pharma and big whoever all day long, and no one in your district would ever hear about it. Now that is starting to change, and that could potentially force a little bit more of a shift in the party, a little more accountability. Ultimately, the biggest success of the Tea Party wasn't so much the individual primaries that were won. It was the fact that they scared the shit out of a lot of Republican incumbents.
Right.
Into supporting them and their priorities ultimately legislatively. And that was extremely popular. Also remember, in any primary, the people who vote are like the most committed ideologues, right? The furthest right or the furthest left people. So it becomes a very real threat, especially in deep blue districts. Like your only real threat then is from your left. So if you have some pressure put there, you can start forcing people to move your way, which is kind of what happened ultimately with Ed Markey too here, where he's been a conventional liberal senator. And because of pressure from his own primary challenge, he's kind of moved himself to the left to align more with the squad, whereas previously it was just kind of like a normal liberal establishment type senator.
Right. And they ended up putting him over the edge, which is important in that competitive primary. I guess just
he
to
owes
wrap this up.
His power to them now.
Exactly. And he can't forget that. I guess just to wrap, one of the things that we talk so much about, obviously on the show and here, is just like this declining faith in institutions. And I got to say, we covered a story this morning on Rising, which has really shaken me about this vaccine. And I think it encapsulates everything about where we are. And so just for context for the audience, like this is Cal Cunningham. He's running in the Democratic seat for the United States Senate against Tom Tillis. He was asked in a debate whether he would take an FDA-approved vaccine, not like some hydroxychloroquine with the Trump stamp on it, like an FDA-approved,
signed,
like made in China, Trump-branded hydroxychloroquine. That's not what we're talking about. It's like we're talking about FDA-approved coronavirus vaccine, and he's like, you know what? I'd be hesitant to take it. And we covered that poll about how 51% only of Americans say that they would take a vaccine. And it's striking me about how deeply people distrust the institutions in American life right now. How are you... Is there a way forward? And what are the consequences of that? Because that's just not about a vaccine. That is about... that is the way you look at the country. That's about the way you think about elections. That's the way that you think about everything. And your fellow citizens. What are the consequences here?
I don't want to be alarmist, but the consequences are as dire as they possibly could be. Like you cannot have a country where everything is tribal. And we have literal armed clashes, not too frequent yet, but they're happening in the streets between rival political gangs. Everything from wearing a face mask to like sending your kids to school to taking a vaccine is becoming partisan and political and tribal. There is no path forward like that. There just isn't. And that's why I look at election day with, deep trepidation. And I don't want to be alarmist here, but when you look at the fact that majority of Americans say that if their candidate doesn't win, they will view the election as rigged. It's actually like higher among Joe Biden supporters, 60 something percent say that if Trump wins, it's only because the election was illegitimate. So even the way we interpret election results now is like completely divided along partisan lines. Every institution, there's no one who is trusted, nothing that is trusted, nothing that is beyond where politics, doesn't touch. Deep distrust between citizen to citizen. I don't know what the answer is, but if we continue in this direction, I mean, it's just not a sustainable track that we are on currently.
Yeah, I really think so.
I mean, this is even pushback, it's just sort of perspective, but I mean, I honestly don't know what I think about a vaccine. Like, I actually don't know if a vaccine sort of showed up. I mean, I would take it, I'm pretty sure, but I definitely just sort of, there's like a neuron ping of like saying like, would you really want to do this? It's basically sort of like, I'm not sure I want to be the first one to jump into this lifeboat. Right. If America is the Titanic right now, which isn't a great metaphor.
Well, that's the thing, Marshall. We're not blaming you. We're not like, oh, you're an idiot for not taking a vaccine. Not just you. I'm saying anyone. I'm saying like, you're like, oh my God, like, this is now like an elite liberal thing. It's obviously Republicans are more likely in the data to say that they won't take a vaccine. It's like a 50-50 split. And I think what it is that the failure of the CDC, Trump's failure really in terms of taking care of the virus, has set us up to a point where, like, I think, Krystal, you were talking about this with mask wearing. It's like the moment mask wearing became politicized and the moment this stuff becomes tribal, then it's kind of over in terms of broad public trust in institutions, which you're supposed to care a lot about. And I think that is really the scariest part. And it's like you point to in terms of election day, like with 2/3 of Biden supporters say they won't accept it. 1/3 of Trump supporters, I think, said something similar, that you're in a situation where it's like, if you can't accept the legitimacy, then there's just no path forward. And I mean, one thing I think, Krystal, what we talked about was about how much damage that tribal media has kind of played into this. To me, and I'm curious what you think, it's you have to believe in a conspiracy, because if you don't believe in a conspiracy, then you can't accede any legitimacy to what the other side believes. And I think that's what it's really all about for them.
Yeah, I mean, on the vaccination thing, and look, like, Trump has made all of this worse because he so nakedly injects politics and personal loyalty into literally everything, right? Every appointee is because they're loyal to me. Everyone, the metric of success is like, how slavishly have they backed me and fallen in line? He just is so naked about all of those things that he makes it all worse, so that it's not crazy when an educated person is like, oh, the vaccine that's coming out of the Trump administration, I'm not sure if I want to be the first one to sign that up. But yeah, then when you have all the incentives in elite media are to be completely tribal, completely partisan, to wherever Trump is, be on the other side, or if you're Fox News, wherever the Democrats are, be on the other side, without regard to any sort of facts or reality, you end up in this place. And I saw all kinds of elite journalists jumping in to defend Cal Cunningham and say, this isn't anti-vaxxer, this is completely like rational. And look, is there a world in which the vaccine is rushed into production in order to try to get in before Election Day? And I would say to people, you shouldn't take, yes, there is a world where that happens. But the point is, you have to wait for the facts before just assuming everything is a conspiracy or inventing a conspiracy. You have to stick to what the facts and the data actually show. And now in the Democratic Party, and I think to extend the Republican Party too, if you don't go all in on the conspiracy theories, then they think that you're like providing comfort to the enemy. You're not on the team. You don't support their values. I mean, you're just like kicked out of the silence altogether. So if you want to succeed, you're not only going to like back the latest conspiracy theory, but you're going to invent your own. That's how you really get to the top.
Yeah. So my last big picture question, that's sort of a recurring theme throughout this conversation, basically comes down to these broad themes we're talking about, sort of distrust in institutions, hypernationalization, various sort of infighting. Would a Trump re-election make things worse, keep them the same? Would a Biden victory make things better? Because this is sort of the big debate people are sort of having. Because if you're sort of, for example, a lot of Biden Republicans will basically say things like, well, look, I think that Trump is sort of the issue, and I may disagree with sort of the radical left, but he ultimately is someone who inflames these things. You could be someone who says, yeah, it's bad right now that half of Americans will literally not take a vaccine because Trump says it, then the other half won't wear a mask until Trump wears a mask. But like, how are we sort of on this like set trajectory, or is sort of the personalities who's in power, will that change that at all?
Okay, so here's what I would say. Two things. Number one, I do think that Biden, just by temperament, like on the vaccine thing, he had a very good answer. He was like, I would take it tomorrow, but I understand, like, and Trump is doing this stuff and it's not good. But I would take a vaccine tomorrow, and we need to do that. I do think by temperament, he will help calm. People don't find him super scary. He uses normal, like standard issue presidential language about unity, about us coming together as Americans. It's not look, I'm not going to oversell it here, but I do think it would turn the temperature down a little bit. And here's the other thing, and maybe, it's not fair to use this as like a selling point, but I don't think liberals are psychologically prepared for Trump to get reelected. Like, if he gets reelected, I really think, there's a lot of the country that is going to completely melt down. Again, they literally think that he is Hitler. So if Hitler gets reelected, what does that justify, right? What sort of actions are ultimately justified in that eventuality? Not that I think things are going to be all cool and calm and collected if Biden gets elected. Trump, after Mitt Romney lost, called for a revolution. So literally on Twitter, called for a revolution. So if he loses, what do you think he's going to say? And his armed supporters, God knows what they will do. So I'm not saying that that's like a panacea either, but I'm hopeful that maybe at least a little bit of calmer, more standard issue rhetoric out of the White House may at least turn the temperature down a couple degrees. That is my hope. Do I have 100% confidence in that? Not at all.
I've been trying not to be a doomer, but I don't know how not to be. So, Krystal.
Me too. I keep trying to talk myself out of it, but here we are.
No, it's not working, sounds like. This has been a total failure of this episode.
Thank you so much for doing this, Krystal. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Appreciate you guys.
Krystal.
Thank you.
Boom.
Awesome.